And now, I wish to bring up our next speaker. Ted Walter is the Director of Strategy and Development for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and a public policy analyst by trade. He has been active in advocating for a new 9/11 investigation since 2009, when he founded the New York City Coalition for Accountability Now, NYC CAN, together with a group of 9/11 family members. In 2015, he authored the AE 9/11 Truth's 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, of which AE 9/11 Truth has distributed more than 50,000 copies. This year, he authored AE 9/11 Truth's 13-page World Trade Center Physics publication, and he was one of the 4 authors of the article in Europhysics News, which has been read more than 350,000 times since August. He has been instrumental in all of AE 9/11 Truth's major strategic initiatives over the past 2 years. Everyone, let's welcome Ted Walter.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today on this very snowy day. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce a video that you're going to see for the next 20 minutes. It's a speech by public interest attorney Daniel Sheehan. He was a keynote speaker at the conference that AE 9/11 Truth and other groups hosted earlier this year during the 9/11 anniversary in New York City at Cooper Union. The conference was called Justice in Focus, and our focus there was to really look at all the evidence that has been compiled over the last 15 years and sort of evaluate it from a legal perspective. How admissible might this evidence be in a court of law? How strong is this evidence? And then also to discuss various legal avenues to actually holding accountable in court those people who were behind the 9/11 attacks. And so we had many lawyers there, we had many 9/11 researchers, and I think many of you were there as well. So thank you for those of you who made it. Since then, I think that the focus of the 9/11 Truth movement has shifted. I don't want to say shifted, but I would say we've opened up a new front, or a new direction that we're looking to pursue, which is legal action within the next couple of years. And really, we're talking about civil litigation that would need to be filed in the next year or two. And so I'm very pleased to say that AE 9/11 Truth is working with Mick Harrison of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry to develop legal strategies for complaints that will be filed within the next year or two. What you're going to see here now is Daniel Sheehan giving us his advice based on his 40 or 50 years of tackling issues, events, crimes related to deep state activities. He's brought many cases over the last years, and you'll see him talk about some of those in his speech related to the Iran-Contra scandal, Karen Silkwood, and others. So let's see what Daniel Sheehan has to tell us. Thank you very much.
Involved in supporting the legal team and who are working on the legal team, they have to be ready to be aggressively criticized by the mainstream media. Not just ridiculed lightly, but aggressively attacked. And I'll give you one particular example. In the Iran-Contra case, we at the Christic Institute had filed the Iran-Contra case back in May of 1986. And there was a dead silence about this. We talked to everybody about it. We talked to people at the New York Times. We talked to people in NBC News. We talked to PBS. We talked to people in Congress about it. There was dead silence until October 5th of 1986, when Eugene Hassenfuss was shot down by the Nicaraguan Sandinista government over Nicaragua in a C-123 flying weapons into the Contras in complete violation of the Boland Amendment. And all that news hit the stands, and right away we were called finally. People kept saying, listen, isn't that the thing the Christic Institute's been trying to tell everybody about? And so what happened is that the journalist community who had said nothing about this, gathered together, and they filled up a place the size of this with professional credentialed journalists in the room. And I got up and I presented to the entire room of some maybe 300 credentialed journalists what we were saying at the Christic Institute about what was really going on behind the whole Iran-Contra crisis. This was a high-level, coordinated criminal conspiracy on the part of government officials in the CIA and in the White House, being run directly out of George H.W. Bush's vice presidential office. And his national security advisor, Donald P. Gregg, was helping to coordinate this whole thing. And so when we got done making this presentation, people's jaws were kind of hanging open in the room. And somebody stood up and he said to Warren Hogue, who was the foreign desk editor of the New York Times, who was standing there on the forum with us, and they said, Warren, why hasn't the New York Times printed anything about this? And he said, gee, I don't know. And so one of the other people in the audience stood up, and now made bold, stands up and says, look, would you give us your promise that you'll send somebody down to the Christic Institute to gather this information? And he said, uncomfortably, he said, okay, I'll do that. And the next week, he sends down a young fellow, like 26 years old, who was in fact a reporter for the agricultural section of the New York Times. And this fellow didn't even know who the Contras were. He didn't even know who they were. So I explained the whole thing to him. I gave him all of the details of this, and I could see him writing like mad. Like he could see Pulitzer Prizes, dancing in his head. 2 days pass, 3 days pass, 4 days pass, a week passes. I give him a call, and I say, Neil, what's the story? He says, well, look, I got to come back down and talk to you. And he says, look, I got a problem here. My editors at the New York Times tell me that you're giving us information that's hearsay information, that you weren't there to see them unloading the cocaine. You weren't there to see them loading the weapons. So I took him around, and I introduced him to pilots that were flying the weapons in. We showed him the end-user certificates. We showed him the serial numbers on the weapons that were being smuggled. We talked to the pilots. We brought him in. They showed him the landing codes to land on John Hull's ranch. So he says, oh, this is it. Pulitzer, here I come. And so he goes back to New York, and I don't hear anything. 2, 3, 4, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. I call him again. I say, Neil, what's the story? Why aren't you doing it? He says, look, I got to come down and talk to you again. He comes back down. He tells me, he said, look, here's my problem. My editors keep telling me that if I'm going to write anything about this story, it has to be negative. It has to be negative about your investigation, or else I can't write anything. And so, I was kind of dumbfounded by that whole thing. So I said, look, let me tell you an additional story and see if this will get you there. And I told him that I had taken all the information over to see Scott Armstrong. Scott Armstrong was the head of the National Security Archives in Washington, D.C. So I go and I sit down with him and I give him all this information. And Scott says, this can't be true. This can't be true, what you're saying. If this were true, I'd know it. I said, well, actually, it is true, and you apparently don't know it. And so I think you should spend a few days checking up your sources and see what you think. He calls me back 3 days later, and he says, Danny, come on, you got to come over. He sits down, he said, my God, he said, this is true. I talked to Cy Hirsch, and I talked to some other guys. They've all confirmed this. He said, look, here's what I'm going to do. He says, I'm going to go over to see Peter Rodino. He's still the chair of the House Judiciary Committee. They have the authority and the responsibility for bringing up articles of impeachment. And this stuff here that you're saying, these are impeachable offenses, not only against Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Donald Gregg, Bill Casey, the head of the CIA. I'm going to go over and talk to him right away. I'll call you back in a couple days. So I said, great. So I leave, and 2 days pass, 3 days pass, 4 days pass, 5 days pass. I don't hear a word. So I call up over there, and I get a hold of Tom Blanton, his assistant. I say, Tommy, what's the matter here? I haven't heard from him. He says, Danny, you got to come on over. I go back over, and I sit down with Blanton. Blanton's got his head hanging down. He said, Danny said, I feel like shit. Scott went over and talked to Peter Rodino. He brought a copy of your complaint, and he gave it to him. Rodino sat there and looked through the whole thing. He turned to Scott, and he said, Scott, this is terrible. This is outrageous. If what's being said here in this complaint is true, why then I mean, I've been telling my constituents for years that if they didn't like the way that American foreign policy was going, they ought to write a letter to their congressman. And if the congressman doesn't do anything, you ought to elect somebody else. Put another congressman in there. But if what's being said in this complaint is true, why then we haven't even been in charge. I'm not going to allow the United States Congress to investigate anything like that, is what he said to him. Okay? So I tell this story to Neil, this agricultural reporter from the New York Times, and he goes back, and the New York Times writes its first story about the Christian Institute lawsuit saying, Dan Sheehan is running around Washington, D.C. irresponsibly telling third-hand stories about aging congressmen. So that this is the kind of thing that you can expect. You're also going to be attacked not only from the right, which is totally to be expected, because they've drunk the Kool-Aid by the gallon that has been fed to them by the 9/11 Commission, but you're also going to be attacked by the sort of harder core left, because they're going to try to want you to file the lawsuit against the Central Intelligence Agency. And you ought to be filing the lawsuit against W. Bush. He's still alive. So is Cheney. Cheney's got a whole new heart. We may have him around for years. So we want you to sue him. You know, and we want you to sue the CIA as an organization. They don't have any kind of understanding, many of the people, about what the legal restrictions are on what you can actually do through the court system. Primarily because the court system has not been set up to do cases like this. They're not set up to actually challenge the government itself. They have a general principle of sovereign immunity that no matter what kind of accusations you make about the government and officials inside the United States government, you cannot sue them unless they agree to it. So they have to agree to allow you to sue them. Or you can sue them under the Federal Tort Claims Act, but you don't get any jury. You can't have a jury. You got to try the case to a federal judge who has been appointed by the president. The judges, any court that you're going to file this case in, state court or federal court, you've got to remember, all of these judges are selected or appointed politically. They are always appointed by a member of the executive branch who just happens to be the same political party that the judge is from. Now, that isn't pertinent in every case, like, a dog bites man case or, a domestic violence case particularly. But the bottom line is, as soon as you start to have a case that has substantial political implications, they're going to be making political decisions. For example, in the Karen Silkwood case, Cy Hirsch, the investigative reporter from the New York Times, comes rushing in the door of the courtroom. This is the Oklahoma federal courtroom, the courthouse that was later bombed. And in he comes, and he says, Dan, what's going on? What's going on? I just got a word from my CIA sources that they're out here on the Silkwood case. What's happening? So I explained the whole thing to him, all about the plutonium being smuggled to Israel, all the details, all the evidence we had about it. He said, gee, they're never going to let you get at that. He says, that's like trying to find out who really killed Kennedy. I mean, this is the chief investigative reporter for the New York Times. And not only that, but he didn't print a word about it. And then Judge Tice comes out on the bench after 15 minutes, and he gets up on the bench and he says, well, Mr. Sheehan, you can be, on the record he says this. He says, well, Mr. Sheehan, you can be certain that it's sinister, he says, but it's also most definitely secret. He says, this is just a glass mountain that you're not going to be allowed to climb in this case. So I am taking judicial notice at this moment that you filed your count 1 in this case under the Federal Civil Rights Act, charging that Ms. Silkwood had had her First Amendment rights to meet with the New York Times violated. She'd had her First Amendment rights to travel freely on the highway safely interfered with. And she'd had her home invaded, a violation of the Fourth Amendment, right of privacy, planting 400 disintegrations per minute of radioactive plutonium on the food in the refrigerator in her house. You've laid out these claims as a violation of her Civil Rights Act. But I want to take judicial notice here that the Federal Civil Rights Act was passed immediately following the end of the Civil War. And I'm taking judicial notice of the fact that the Civil War was fought solely for the purpose of freeing the black race from slavery. And therefore, the Federal Civil Rights Act applies only to black people. And since you've not alleged anywhere within the four corners of your complaint that Ms. Silkwood was a member of the Negro race, I'm going to be summarily dismissing this count from the complaint. dismissed the entire part about running off the highway, being killed, her body disappearing for 48 hours. They finally found it in the morgue at the Oklahoma City Hospital, a Jane Doe tag on her toe with all of her internal organs completely missing, okay? And that was not justiciable. That was not justiciable because that was under the Federal Civil Rights Act, and we hadn't claimed that she was a member of the Negro race. The judge in the case that you're going to be doing is not going to be your friend. They are not going to give you access to the federal rules of civil discovery just because the law says they have to. They will block you, they will resist you, they will ignore your motions to compel. So the fact of the matter is you're going to have a major mass-based movement behind what you're trying to do. And you're going to have a full-time coordinator of the media who's going to be reaching out and putting the stories on the internet, putting the stories into all of the alternative media, going to try to get the major news media to report these things. You have to have a full-scale operation going. And you need to have a field organizer, a grassroots organizer that organizes out around the country and organizes task force and teams in virtually every congressional district in the country. The Karen Silkwood case we had during the Iran-Contra case, we had like 1,000 Christic action teams. Many of you may have been members of those. So that they were writing letters to the editor. If Oliver North showed up somewhere to go to speak at the Kiwanis Club or something, they would all come and fill the room and jump up and down and ask him questions. You know, these are the kind of things that you're going to have to be prepared to do. Jimmy Carter, you remember, was trying to negotiate to get our hostages back. And during that negotiation, Gary Sick was his assistant in the National Security Council. And it became perfectly evident that somebody inside the National Security Council was leaking the information about the state of these negotiations to Bill Casey, who was the campaign chairman for Reagan and Bush. We developed all the evidence that showed that Bill Casey met with representatives of the Hezbollah to negotiate with them to keep the American hostages, to keep them in custody until after the election in 1980, so that Reagan and Bush could win by showing that Jimmy Carter was weak and vacillating and couldn't really even get our own hostages back. And Gary Sick wrote a book about this in the aftermath of all this called The October Surprise. And Gary Sick wrote a really interesting piece in the conclusion of his book in which he said, those of us who have lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years or more have become accustomed to the various political scandals. An individual congressman is caught with his hand in the till, or another senator is found to be a persistent womanizer, and all of their colleagues rush in to excoriate them. And the news media flock in and reprimand them in a great celebration of showing how the system works and how they've called this person to account. He said, these are petty offenses. And there's another whole category of political offense, described by the French poet André Chenier as les crimes puissants qui font trembler la loi. They're offenses so grave that they cause the very foundation of the law itself to tremble. And he said that we know what to do with someone caught misappropriating funds, but when confronted with evidence of a systematic attempt to undermine the very democratic political system itself, we all recoil in a general failure of nerve. I've lived this for 50 years. We've been in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. We've been on the inside of these things for a long time. I'm telling you, this is one major hill that you're talking about climbing. But we have climbed a few in the past, all of us together. And the fact of the matter is that this may well be the biggest hill ever because of the type of theories that are being implied by some of this evidence that is being developed are so extraordinary that they qualify as one of these types of crimes that shake the very foundations of the legal order itself. be prepared for this type of a confrontation, and you need to not wilt in the face of this. And so you need to be extremely careful about who you select as your plaintiffs. If you select an individual plaintiff, that the forces that we're dealing with potentially here will go to almost any lengths to buy them off, to offer them everything that they've ever wanted and more. So you have to have people who are dedicated down to the very soles of their feet to get at the truth of what's happened here. You have to be extremely careful about who you name as defendants, because you need to remember that naming high enough level officials are going to cause them to invoke national security claims. They're going to refuse to produce the discovery. The judges are going to go along with their national security claims. So you need to have, as consultants to your legal team, people who are experts at the particular trial court that you select, the Court of Appeals that has jurisdiction over that and who the personnel are on that particular Court of Appeals, and have experience in litigating appeals in front of that court. This is going to be extremely high-level litigation. And you can bet that you're not going to have any big law firms lining up to help you. So the bottom line is this is going to be a major challenge. You have to gird yourself for this, and ultimately you're going to have to, prior to the filing of your complaint, you're going to have to determine what the exact theory of your case is. You can't really go into a case like this saying, well, maybe they were dupes, maybe they were incompetent, maybe this, maybe that. You may be able to do that, and if a Boeing 757 were to land only on top of your private house, you as a plaintiff's lawyer, you can sue the airplane company, you can sue the people that are manufacturers, you can sue the Pilots Association, you can sue the weatherman. You can sue anybody you want, and then you can sort of peel them away as the discovery unveils information. That isn't going to happen in this case. You're going to get one shot at this. You're going to get one shot at laying in what the theory of the case is and who it is that did what to whom, and who was involved in the support network. And you're going to have to put that in front of them, because the judges are going to apply, just like the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals did, a heightened level of scrutiny over the factual information that you bring in at the initial front end of this litigation, okay? And they're going to try to dismiss it under Rule 12b-6. They're going to say, well, even if you could prove what you say, there's a legal problem that you can't really get at this. Or they're going to say that it's ineffective in convincing us, the judge, that is, convincing us that you can, in fact, get the kind of court-admissible evidence that you're going to need to prove every essential element of the claim, even if we give you access to civil discovery. You're going to have that to confront. The last item I'll leave you with is, do not drink your own Kool-Aid. Okay? Do not drink your own Kool-Aid. Don't come up with some great theory that necessarily Dick Cheney sat in the bunker and coordinated all this from a single-eye computer, and just because that happens to fit your own ideological predisposition. The bottom line is you're going to have to work at this thing from the bottom up, gather your information, discern the patterns, identify your defendants, identify your causes of action, then go after this in a big way. And once you start, you better not stop. You better not stop, you better not delay. You're going to have to go all the way on this thing. So that's just my advice from 50 years in front of the courts in this country. So that's my advice. I'm giving it to you for free. Okay?
Hi there. Did you guys like that? Yeah. Good? Good. So I just wanted to add that's like 20 minutes out of a documentary that we will be releasing in the coming months about the Justice in Focus conference. So keep an eye out for it. Thank you.